Alyssa, have you heard of the Chicken Kit project?
Is that like tiny overalls for chickens?
Not quite, but the name does make it sound that way. It's brand new. You know World Central Kitchen, Jose Andres' organization. They normally show up after earthquakes and hurricanes with hot meals. They've started doing something completely different in Ukraine's Donetsk region. Instead of another hot meal or food kit, they're handing out live point of lay hens. That is, chickens already old enough to lay eggs immediately.
Wait, I thought we were doing an episode on Heifer International, not World Central Kitchen.
We are, but World Central Kitchen is an interesting way in. They're the hot meal people. And this chicken project is basically a real time version of the same question Heifer has been built around for decades. Is it more powerful to give someone food or to give them a way to produce food themselves? And it's not just a small experiment. World Central Kitchen has now delivered hens across 7 regions of Ukraine. In Nokrikiev, a town right near the front line, they delivered 800 hens to 80 households. That's 10 hens per family.
So it sounds like with this, World Central Kitchen is making a different bet. Not just food for this week, but something that might keep feeding a family after the food delivery is done.
Their own regional lead in Donetsk, a man named Serhiy, put it simply: when you deliver a food kit, people are grateful, but it's gone in a week. When you bring in a living creature, it's different. Families suddenly have something to care for and something that produces value every single day. He called it hope for life. And here's the connection for our episode. World Central Kitchen didn't invent that idea. It originated independently from an internal team brainstorm about what they could offer beyond meals. But there's an organization that has been running almost exactly that bet, a living animal instead of a handout, for over 80 years, and built a $100 million operation on top of it.
Heifer International.
The difference so far is that World Central Kitchen's chicken program is something Ukrainian families receive, but it is not, as far as we can find, something a donor in Ohio can go online and personally buy as a $50 gift item the way Heifer's catalog works. World Central Kitchen just finished the pilot phase and is now deciding what comes next, but they haven't turned it into a retail product yet. And what makes that question complicated is the thing being sold is much bigger than the catalog price suggests. Take a dairy cow. By Heifer's own estimates, getting one cow to a family with training, veterinary support, and everything else that goes with it can cost around $3,000. That's for a household whose entire annual income may be closer to $500.
So it's not really buy someone a cow. It's asking donors to buy into a whole theory of change.
Right. And that theory has attracted some serious skepticism, including Jane Goodall.
Which raises the question, when an organization learns more about what actually creates lasting change, can its fundraising product change with it?
Or is there always a lag between what the organization now believes works and what it's still selling on the page? I'm Rebby Sterling.
And I'm Alyssa Stern, and this is Perdure.
Quick disclaimer: Perdure is for information and entertainment only. Nothing here is financial, legal, or professional advice. The views are ours alone, not our employers, not our clients, not anyone we've ever worked for. We fact check against primary sources and we correct mistakes. So if you catch something, tell us. We're not affiliated with, endorsed by, or sponsored by any of the organizations we cover.
So Heifer has a great origin story. It's 1936 during the Spanish Civil War. Dan West is 33, a farmer from Preble County, Ohio, and he's also a member of the Church of the Brethren. He volunteers as a relief worker. The Brethren are one of the historic peace churches alongside the Quakers and the Mennonites. West's job was to distribute powdered milk to displaced children. Day after day, he watched them line up, measured out portions, and handed over cups.
And then an idea hits him.
He later distilled the idea to a simple phrase: not a cup, but a cow. In other words, not just milk for today, but a way for a family to produce food over time.
Okay, but give them a cow doesn't by itself explain how you build a functioning nonprofit around it. What's the mechanism?
Right. The novel part isn't just the cow, it's the condition attached to it. Pass on the gift. A family that receives an animal agrees to pass along its first female offspring to another family in need. So it works like this. Family 1 receives a cow. When it has a calf, Family 1 keeps the original cow and passes the calf to Family 2. Eventually, Family 2 passes an offspring to Family 3. Nobody repays Heifer directly. The obligation moves forward from family to family rather than back to the organization.
Oh, so it's not a loan.
Different from the Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus microfinance model, which also works through communities. But there, borrowers receive loans and repay them. Heifer's model is different. What gets passed on is a living asset, not a cash repayment.
Which changes the shape of the growth curve.
Completely. A loan fund depends on repayment in cash on time before the money can be lent again. This model can expand because the asset itself reproduces. It's not compounding interest, it's compounding biology. And there's another effect that may matter just as much. In a straightforward handout, you remain the recipient. In this model, the recipient also becomes a giver. West built that reversal into the design. You go from needing help to being able to provide it.
Oh, this is where the program model and the fundraising model start to pull apart, though. The catalog can make it sound as though one donor buys an animal for one family. But the program's real logic is broader: training, follow-up, and a chain of families passing value forward over time. The product on the page is a single gift. The model behind it is a community system.
West brought the idea home through his Church of the Brethren networks in Indiana. By 1942, the church had adopted the Heifer Project as an official program, and 2 years later, it became a separate organization called Heifers for Relief. And then came the test. Could you actually move livestock across an ocean and get it safely to families who needed it? There's one historical detail I want to just clear up a bit. A lot of retelling says that the first shipment left from York, Pennsylvania, but the more precise version is that the cattle began their journey in Napanee, Indiana. On June 12, 1944, 18 heifers left Napanee by train, headed for Mobile, Alabama. 4 days later, they arrived at the port. One animal got sick and had to stay behind, so 17 heifers boarded the SS William D. Bloxam. They sailed from Mobile on July 14th and arrived in San Juan, Puerto Rico 8 days later. 16 of the 17 survived the crossing.
Why not just buy the cows in Puerto Rico?
That's the obvious question. The records don't give us a clean answer, like local cattle weren't available or shipping was cheaper. What they do show is that this began as a donated livestock project. Farmers and churches in the U.S. were giving heifers to the new program, and the organizers needed a place where those animals could be put to use. Puerto Rico wasn't a random choice. The Church of the Brethren already had a service project in Castañer, in the island's interior, and were working there alongside the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration. So there was already a network on the ground when the first 16 heifers arrived in 1944.
Still, shipping cows across the ocean is a little crazy.
It is. And it tells you something about the model from the beginning. The gift wasn't cash sent to buy an animal locally. It was a donated animal with all the logistics and risks that came with moving it. And by the way, the first calf born after the shipment was named Faith.
Let's get into the mission and business model alignment. When a donor buys a goat from the catalog, what do they think they're buying?
They think they're buying one animal for one family. They get a receipt, a photo, and maybe a card for Uncle Gary's birthday.
And what does that money fund in practice today?
I'm guessing something much bigger.
Right. The animal is real, and the catalog does say that the gifts include training. But over 80 years, Heifer's work has expanded far beyond delivering livestock. It now includes farmer training, women's groups, cooperatives, animal health services, access to finance, connections to buyers, and support for the systems that let small farms earn a durable income. The goat is the visible part, but it is only one part of the intervention.
So the catalog is selling the most emotionally legible piece of a much more complicated model.
Yes, and that gap between the simple thing a donor can picture and the larger system the program actually depends on didn't appear overnight. In some ways, it was present from the beginning. Dan West's original plan was never as simple as give someone a cow. In a 1944 draft, he described dairy heifers donated by farmers and cared for on local farms while supporters covered feed and related costs. The project wanted to send those animals to countries devastated by war, but West acknowledged that it could only happen only when priorities and shipping allow.
So he saw that they needed a workable way to move the cows.
And the first shipments depended on churches, farmers, rail lines, ports, ships, relief agencies, and people who knew how to care for livestock. The cow was never the whole product. The cow plus all of that infrastructure was the product. And after World War II, Heifer found an extraordinary workaround. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, a 44-nation relief body, they needed people who knew how to care for livestock at sea. And the Brethren Service Committee agreed to recruit them. These animal tenders became known as seagoing cowboys. In return, UNRRA agreed to transport Heifer Project animals without charge under the project's own terms as gifts for pre-selected farming families.
Seagoing cowboy, love that. Who were they?
They came from across the United States and Canada. Some were farmers, obviously, but the group also included students, teachers, ministers, veterans, carpenters, plumbers, doctors, really people from all kinds of backgrounds. They ranged in age from teenagers to men in their 70s. The common denominator was that they were willing to spend weeks at sea feeding, watering, cleaning up after, and treating animals in conditions that could get pretty miserable pretty fast.
Were they volunteers?
It depends on which part of the story we're talking about. During the UNRRA program, at least some of them, including men assigned from civilian public service, were paid $150 a trip. They had to get Coast Guard seamen's papers, pass a physical, and were expected to roughly care for 25 animals. Later, after UNRRA wound down, the cowboys and cowgirls who continued transporting heifer animals were unpaid volunteers.
Sounds like seagoing cowboy was less a job title than a temporary, extreme intense livestock and relief assignment.
Exactly. And it operated at a scale that is hard to picture. From mid-1945 through April of 1947, UNRRA made about 360 livestock shipments using 73 ships and carrying more than 239,000 animals to Europe and China. More than 7,000 men and boys served as seagoing cowboys. Later, when Heifer continued the shipments with volunteer crews, a small number of women joined them as seagoing cowgirls. Heifer's own animals were a small share of that larger operation, around 4,000, but the project could plug into an international relief system that was vastly bigger than itself.
I'm guessing it wasn't a comfy cruise.
No, the conditions could be brutal. In December 1945, the SS Henry Dearborn left Baltimore with 411 heifers bound for then Czechoslovakia. During the crossing, a Christmas Eve storm damaged a livestock pen and killed some of the cattle. One crew member described a wave roughly 40 feet high, reaching even the captain's quarters. Across UNRRA's livestock program as a whole, the reported loss rate was about 3.8%. That is still a huge number of animals. But given the weather, the converted wartime ships, and the scale of the operation, it's a lot lower than you might expect.
So what I'm getting is that animal aid was really a delivery system made up of farmers, churches, animal handlers, ships, and the UN itself.
Exactly. The living animal was always the visible piece, but the expertise and systems around it were what made the gift usable. And that system was built around a philosophy that was broader than any one country or any one donor base. There's a story from the post-war period that gets at that. A Church of the Brethren account describes a debate over sending heifers to the Soviet Union. Some board members worried it would alienate American donors. Dan West's response, as that account recounts it, was that a heifer is not aware of any iron or bamboo curtain and cannot distinguish between the hungry cries of communist or capitalist children. And it shows the tension was already taking shape. The founding philosophy was bigger and more universal than any individual fundraising pitch could comfortably contain. Before we go any further, let's talk about why this is different from the central question in our other episodes. Does the fundraising story match the program reality? That's a diagnostic we use every time, but the mechanism changes.
Take Susan G. Komen. There, the central issue was branding. A symbol, the pink ribbon, became so powerful that it could risk overshadowing the mission it was built to fund.
Save the Children raised a different question. Child sponsorship created a personal story, your money, this child, even as the organization's work was structured around broader community programs. Save the Children US has since ended its individual child sponsor option.
Girl Scouts is a structural and governance question. The cookie program is a national brand, but Girl Scouts says 100% of its net cookie revenue stays with the local councils and troops.
And Sierra Club is a democracy question. A member-elected board can be one of the organization's greatest assets, and when the turnout is low, one of its vulnerabilities.
UNICEF's tension is about speed. Whether a large institution can adapt quickly enough when an outside funding decision creates an immediate shock for children who cannot wait.
And Heifer is different from all of these. This is not primarily a story about an organization sustaining a fiction, a symbol outgrowing the mission, revenue going somewhere unexpected, or a governance structure becoming vulnerable. It is a story about an organization's theory of change getting more sophisticated. Over time, Heifer moved from an individual asset to a family, to a community, to a market system. The catalog page still begins with the simplest possible version of that, an animal.
This is a story about an organization outrunning its own product.
Exactly. Not really a flaw, but a learning curve that got ahead of the sales pitch. This is a good time to let our listeners know about the DevX podcast network, of which we are proudly a part of.
Want to stay up to date with the latest news in humanitarian crises, global health, food security, and philanthropy? Then dive into the week's most critical stories with DevX's This Week in Global Development podcast. DevX is the platform for insider journalism on global development. Each week we break down major headlines and invite members of our newsroom to share their expert analysis. Whether it's the rollout of next-generation malaria vaccines, a restructuring of the development finance architecture, or investments in climate-resilient agriculture, we ensure you have the insights you need to navigate the sector and stay informed on the latest trends and policy changes shaping global development. Subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform via the link in the description.
Let's talk about the catalog. This is where Heifer becomes a very different kind of fundraising proposition. A typical charity appeal might ask you to support a cause and trust that something good will happen somewhere. Heifer gives you a much more concrete story. You are not giving to hunger relief in the abstract. You are choosing a goat, a flock of chicks, a heifer, or a water buffalo.
I remember watching The West Wing, the episode where President Bartlett is meant to do a photo op with a cow, and a goat shows up instead. I didn't realize until much later that the organization in that joke was Heifer International.
Which tells you how culturally legible this idea has become. By 2003, Give Someone a Cow was a shorthand the show expected its audience to understand. The episode is called Guns Not Butter, and it's built around a fight over foreign aid.
And the appeal is instantly clear. You buy the animal, a family receives the animal, and the animal changes that family's life.
Right, so Heifer takes a complicated development program and gives donors a way to picture it in just 1 second. And the catalog works like retail. It has an entry point, a middle, and a spectacular top tier. A flock of chicks costs $20, a goat $120, a heifer $500. And the 5,000 Gift Ark includes 2 water buffaloes, 2 cows, 2 sheep, 2 goats, plus bees, chicks, rabbits, and more.
So you can spend $20 and feel like you've given something tangible. Or you can spend $5,000 and buy the nonprofit equivalent of the deluxe package.
The range is part of the appeal. Goats, sheep, pigs, chickens, ducks, rabbits, bees, fish, silkworms, llamas, water buffalo. But the catalog now includes things that make the broader model more visible too. Women's self-help groups, clean water systems, solar kits, and farmer training.
Which tells you Heifer knows that the animal is not the whole intervention, but the animal is still the emotional anchor. Put that next to Girl Scout cookies. In both cases, a donor gets a tangible, priced thing to rally around.
The difference from Girl Scout cookies is important. A cookie is a fundraising mechanism. Girl Scouts say that 100% of cookie program net revenue stays with local councils and troops. No one thinks that the box of Thin Mints is itself the program. With Heifer, the animal in the catalog is supposed to connect directly to the work. You see a goat or a heifer, you picture that animal reaching a family and producing milk, income, or food. That is part of why it built Global Village. Beginning in the early 1990s, Heifer Ranch in Arkansas ran immersive education programs for school groups, church groups, and college students. Participants could spend the night in a village-style setting and take part in activities meant to prompt discussion about hunger, poverty, housing, and scarce resources. The settings drew inspiration from places like Zambia, Guatemala, Appalachia, and urban neighborhoods. The point was not simply here's a goat. It was here is some of the context in which a goat might or might not change a family's life. In 2019, Heifer Ranch ended its public field trips and experiential education programs, shifting its focus toward farmer training and regenerative agriculture. And there's one more reason the catalog matters. It was not just how donors learned about Heifer. It was how Heifer financed much of its work. In 2011, NPR reported Heifer International then president and CEO Pierre Ferrari describing the organization as either the champagne business, selling almost everything on New Year's Eve, or the turkey business, built around one giant holiday spike. NPR reported at the time that Heifer mailed about 16 million holiday catalogs each year, and that roughly 80 to 85% of its annual revenue arrived around Christmas.
So that simple animal story was not just a nice way for donors to understand Heifer. It was the organization's economic engine. The catalog had to make the work feel familiar and giftable to an American donor, even when the underlying livelihoods looked very different from an American farm. Take guinea pigs, for example. In the States, they read as pets. But for families in Peru, guinea pigs are an important and traditional source of protein and income. Heifer supported guinea pig raising there as part of its work with rural households.
That's a great example of the catalog's trick. It makes a very specific local livelihood understandable to someone shopping for a holiday gift.
So the catalog made animal giving culturally legible to millions of people. But once that simple story becomes so successful, it creates the question at the center of this episode. Can the story that brings donors in keep up with everything the organization has learned about what actually creates change?
The catalog's success gave Heifer something every nonprofit wants, a simple story that millions of donors understood. But success also created a problem. The more money Heifer raised, the more it had to prove that an animal was not just a simple gift. It was part of a program capable of producing lasting change.
And the leader who built that program at scale was Joe Luck. Joe Luck became Heifer International's president and CEO in 1992. By her own account, Heifer's annual budget was about $7 million when she became CEO, and had grown to more than $130 million by the time she stepped away.
This is the era when Heifer goes from a recognizable charity to a seriously large international organization.
And the catalog was a major part of that growth. But Luck's contribution was not just fundraising. She helped turn the idea behind the animal gift into an operating model that could travel across countries and communities. That model was the 12 cornerstones for just and sustainable development. They were not a checklist that came after the animal arrived, but they were meant to shape how the project worked from the beginning.
How did that work?
It meant that the animal was never supposed to be a standalone gift. Participants received training. They made commitments around accountability, passing on the gift, environmental stewardship, gender and family inclusion, and what Heifer calls full participation. And the cornerstones included spirituality, not as religious conversion, but as shared values, connection, and mutual responsibility. Heifer explicitly says it is not affiliated with a religion, despite its Church of the Brethren roots.
Full participation is one of those phrases that can sound good without telling you much. What does it actually require?
At its best, it means the community helps decide what the project should be, not headquarters in Little Rock looking at a spreadsheet and deciding every household needs a dairy cow. The questions are more local. What animal fits this climate? Is there enough water and feed? Is there veterinary care nearby? Is there a market for milk, eggs, wool, or meat? And who in the household will control that income? And there was one more important operational change. Heifer had already begun moving away from shipping U.S. livestock overseas in the 1960s. Instead, it increasingly sourced animals locally or regionally, usually within the country where a project operated.
That makes a lot more sense. A locally adapted animal is more likely to fit the climate, disease conditions, available feed, and local farming practices.
Yes. And it means that the money spent on livestock can stay closer to the communities where the work is happening. The organization received major outside validation during Luck's tenure, too. In 2004, Heifer won the $1 million Conrad N. Hilton Humanitarian Prize. At the time, it was one of the world's largest humanitarian awards for a nonprofit. And by the way, Luck is not distant history. She only recently died on November 26, 2025, at age 83. Pierre Ferrari became Heifer's president and CEO in October 2010. His path there was unusual for a development leader. He was born in 1950 in what was then the Belgian Congo. His family fled amidst the violence that followed Congolese independence, first to Brussels and later to other countries. Before joining Heifer, Ferrari spent 2 decades in the beverage industry and became senior vice president of marketing at Coca-Cola USA. He later worked at CARE as a special assistant to the president, served on the board of the Small Enterprise Assistance Fund, and chaired the board of Ben & Jerry's.
So he came in with experience from corporate marketing, international development, impact investing, and a famously values-driven consumer brand.
Yes, he pushed the organization to think much more explicitly about markets, income, and the systems surrounding smallholder farmers. Here's the basic shift. The older catalog-friendly story begins with an asset. A family lacks a productive animal. You provide one. The animal produces milk, eggs, offspring, or income, and the family is better off. That is not wrong, but it's incomplete. A dairy cow does not solve a problem if there's no affordable veterinary care, no cold storage, no reliable transport, no access to credit, or only one buyer who can dictate a low price. Under Ferrari, Heifer increasingly described its work in terms of inclusive market systems. Instead of focusing only on what one household receives, the organization looked at a wider network of the household: suppliers, veterinary services, and banks, cooperatives, processors, buyers, infrastructure, even government rules. So the question changes from, did this family receive an animal, to, does this family have a real path to a sustainable living income? And what has to change around them for that to exist? The animal may be part of the answer, but so are fair buyers, vet care, affordable feed, credit, transport, and the family's ability to keep more of the value it creates, an asset or increased income by the sum amount. Eventually, Heifer paired that approach with a living income framework. Its measure of success was no longer simply whether a household received an asset or increased income by some amount. The question became whether every person in the household had enough income for a dignified life. That includes nutritious food, decent housing, healthcare, education, other basic needs, and some capacity to handle emergencies.
And that number has to be local. A living income in rural Nepal is not the same as a living income in rural Ethiopia.
Ferrari announced in 2022 that he would retire at the end of September. What Ferrari left behind was not a rejection of the animal gift. It was a more demanding claim that lasting poverty reduction requires more than productive assets. It requires the market, services, institutions, and local power around those assets to work too.
Let's look at the numbers, because this is where you can see what Heifer has become. Sarita Sandesham became Heifer International's president and CEO on October 1st, 2022. She was born and raised in Singapore and came to Heifer from Heartland Alliance International, where she was the executive director. Before that, she was vice president of programs at Synergos, building partnerships across government, business, and civil society on behalf of smallholder farmers and other vulnerable communities.
So she did not arrive to invent a new strategy from scratch.
No, she inherited an organization that had already moved beyond the old animal-by-animal theory of change. Her job had been to carry forward the market systems and living income strategy, and to scale it. In fiscal year 2024, Heifer reported working with 1.3 million participant households across 19 countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Heifer has said that it aims to help 10 million households close the living gap by the year 2030.
1 to 10 million households? How are they going to do that?
It looks different in every country, but the pattern is consistent. Heifer identifies an important agricultural value chain: dairy, poultry, rice, tomatoes, and then works on the barriers that keep farmers from earning enough from it. In Nigeria, that means poultry, rice, and tomatoes, with a major focus on women and young people. In Nepal, it means dairy. In Malawi, the goal is to help 500,000 smallholder farmers build more resilient livelihoods. And the biggest part of the strategy is Hatching Hope. Hatching Hope is Heifer's global poultry partnership with Cargill. Its goal is much broader than Heifer's 10 million household living income target. Hatching Hope wants to improve nutrition and economic livelihoods for 100 million people by 2030.
So that count includes more than the farm households directly participating in the program.
Right. Hatching Hope is trying to change a poultry system, from farmers to markets to consumers. Heifer's 10 million figure is about households reaching a more specific economic threshold, a living income.
Different unit, different standard.
Heifer now measures success at several levels at once: a household reaching a living income, a local market working better, and, with partnerships like Hatching Hope, millions of people having better access to nutrition and economic opportunity.
So we've spent this episode looking at the gap between a simple thing a donor buys and the much larger program Heifer actually runs. Now we have to ask the hard question: does that larger program work? The answer is not a clean yes or no. The evidence points in several directions, and it helps to separate them. Let's start with the standards set by organizations like GiveWell. GiveWell's public critique of Heifer are not saying livestock can never help a family. The question is whether the available evidence showed that each donated dollar produces a measurable, lasting improvement in well-being compared with other ways of spending that dollar. GiveWell cited research from Rwanda estimating that the fully loaded cost of delivering a pregnant cow, animal training and support, was roughly $3,000 per household,
against an estimated annual household income of about $500.
which makes $3,000 sound enormous until you ask the next question: what does that cow produce over its lifetime? How much income does the family earn? Do offspring get passed on? And does the family still benefit after the formal program ends? A price tag alone cannot answer that. The outcome depends on whether the animal stays healthy, whether the household can afford feed and care, whether there's buyer for the milk or livestock, and whether the family can keep enough of the value it creates.
Which is why cash becomes the obvious comparison.
Cash gives a household the freedom to decide what would help most: livestock, school fees, debt repayment, a roof repair, tools, seeds, or something else entirely. And research on cash transfer shows that households sometimes use cash to build productive assets, including livestock, on their own terms.
So the real test is not cow or no cow.
Right. It should be, when does a livestock package create more durable value than giving a household the equivalent resources directly? That is the comparison the evidence still does not cleanly resolve. We should also be fair. Heifer does have outcome evidence. A 2012 evaluation by Paul Clements at Western Michigan's University's Evaluation Center examined heifer programs in Albania, Nepal, and Uganda. Using the data available from those programs, it concluded that they were cost-effective at improving household income, assets, and nutrition. That's useful evidence, but it was not a randomized comparison between heifer and cash transfers.
Right. From 2014 through 2018, researchers conducted a randomized controlled trial in rural Nepal in partnership with Heifer. The study tested livestock transfers bundled with extensive context-specific training for women. Positive welfare effects and an estimated benefit-cost ratio of 2.5 for the full livestock and training model and 3.7 for a lower-cost version. The researchers also found that passing on the gift was important to the model's cost-effectiveness. So the evidence says something more nuanced than either a goat always works or a goat is a waste of money.
In at least some contexts, livestock combined with training can improve livelihoods and generate benefits greater than its costs.
But what these studies don't tell us is whether those same households would have done better or worse or the same with an equal value cash transfer.
There is a separate criticism that is not mainly about development economics. It's about animals, ecology, and resource use. In 2021, In Defense of Animals and the Animal Save movement launched the Stop Animal Gifting campaign. Jane Goodall joined the campaign's calls for charities to move away from live animal gifts towards plant-based and irrigation projects. Goodall's argument was as practical as it was ethical. Animals need feed, water, land, and veterinary care. In places facing drought, high feed costs, water scarcity, or weak animal health services are an additional burden rather than an asset. That campaign's claims should be understood as the position of animal rights advocates, not as a neutral evaluation of every livestock program.
Even so, the underlying question is real. Does this particular animal fit this particular ecological and economic setting?
Heifer's current approach reflects that concern. The organization says it now sources almost all of its project animals locally, within the country where the project operates, rather than shipping U.S. animals abroad. And there's one more complication that the old dairy cow catalog image can obscure. Milk is not automatically a nutritional solution everywhere. Lactose malabsorption is common globally, but the prevalence varies sharply across and within regions. A major global review estimated adult lactose malabsorption at about 63% in sub-Saharan Africa and 64% in Asia outside the Middle East. At the same time, many African pastoralist communities have high rates of lactase persistence because of long histories of herding and milk consumption.
So you can't look at Africa or Asia and make one blanket claim about whether dairy makes sense.
Right. A dairy cow may still be valuable even when a household does not drink much milk. The family may process or sell the milk, use manure as fertilizer, or benefit from breeding. But it does mean that the milk equals nutrition comment is too simple. In some places, the stronger argument for dairy is income, not direct household consumption. And then there are chickens. In 2016, Bill Gates launched Coop Dreams with Heifer International, pledging more than 100,000 chickens for poor families, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. Gates described poultry as a low-cost way for people living in extreme poverty to produce food and income. But chickens don't work everywhere. In Bolivia, there was a sharp public response from Bolivia's Minister of Land and Rural Development. He called the idea offensive and argued that Bolivia already had a substantial domestic poultry sector, producing roughly 197 million chickens a year and exporting about 36 million.
This isn't evidence that chickens cannot help poor households, but it is evidence that a country with an established poultry industry may not need outsiders arriving with a story about teaching it how to raise chickens.
True. The controversy does not prove that Heifer's models fail everywhere. It shows why the question cannot begin with, what animal would make a donor feel helpful? It has to begin with, what do people in this specific place already produce, need, control, and want?
Let me try to pull the 80-year arc together, because Heifer has been asking itself versions of the same question from the beginning. What does a family need in order to build a lasting livelihood? Dan West's first answer was simple. A cup of milk helps today, a cow might help tomorrow. It can produce milk, income, manure, and offspring. The cow is meant to be a durable asset, not temporary relief.
But an animal on its own has limits.
Right, a cow can get sick. A family needs feed, water, training, veterinary care, and a way to sell what the animal produces. So Heifer's next answer was not just more cows. It was community, training, women's groups, passing on the gift, accountability, and the 12 cornerstones. The idea was that an animal is more valuable when the household receiving it is part of a strong, organized local network.
And then Heifer learned that even a strong community can be stuck inside a weak market.
A group of well-trained dairy farmers still cannot earn a living if they have no affordable feed, no veterinary services, no refrigeration, no access to credit, and only one buyer setting the price. That is why the strategy widened again, from the household to the community to the market systems around both. Cup, cow, community, market. Each step is an answer to the limitations of the one before it, and each step is a bigger, more complicated, harder to photograph unit of change than the last.
Which leaves the actual unresolved question underneath this whole episode. What happens when an organization's program theory outgrows the product its donors understand?
Heifer could try to educate donors into a more complicated product. You are not buying a goat, you are helping to build a dairy or a poultry market system. That would be more precise, but much harder to understand, much harder to give as a holiday gift, and probably much harder to sell. It could retire the catalog and replace it with a fundraising product that better reflects its market systems approach. But that would mean taking a serious revenue risk without knowing whether a more complicated product would bring donors along. Or it could keep doing what it largely does now. Use the animal as the donor's entry point while running a far more complicated program behind it.
That third option may not be intellectually tidy, but it may be practically necessary.
And there's an irony here. The catalog was built on a powerful idea. Aid should produce something lasting, not just relieve suffering for a day. A cow, not a cup of milk. Over time, that same idea forced Heifer to ask a harder question. What does a cow need around it in order to succeed? The answer kept getting bigger until it finally outgrew the catalog page where the story began.
And that's not necessarily institutional failure. It may be what learning looks like when an organization takes its own evidence seriously. Let's switch lenses one more time. Leslie Crutchfield and Heather McLeod Grant's Forces for Good examined 12 high-impact nonprofits and identified 6 practices they argued were associated with outsized social impact. Make markets work, inspire evangelists, nurture nonprofit networks, master the art of adaptation, share leadership, and advocate and serve. This is not a scientific scorecard, and it is not a verdict on Heifer, but it gives us a useful way to ask what Heifer does especially well, and where the evidence is thinner. So let's start with their Make Markets Work, because it is almost unnervingly on the nose for this episode. Instead of treating buyers, suppliers, financial institutions, and processors as obstacles outside the program, Heifer increasingly treats them as part of the intervention. The goal is not only to help a farmer produce more, it is to help create the conditions in which producing more can lead to a living income.
And that's probably the practice that now defines Heifer's program strategy most clearly.
Next, let's look at Inspire Evangelists. Heifer has been unusually good at this from the beginning. The catalog turns an abstract donation into a story someone can repeat. We gave a goat in your name. It gives donors a tangible way to explain their gifts to friends, children, relatives, and colleagues. The animal is not just a program input, it's the storytelling device. And the fact that Heifer appeared in a West Wing plotline in 2003 shows how recognizable that idea became in American culture.
So the catalog is not just a revenue tool. It is Heifer's most durable form of public engagement.
Now, Nurture Nonprofit Networks is a little more mixed. Historically, the UNRRA partnership shows Heifer working inside much larger systems. The Brethren Service Committee supplied people with livestock expertise. UNRRA supplied the shipping infrastructure. That arrangement allowed a young organization to do more than it could have done alone. And today, Hatching Hope shows the same instinct in a different form. A large partnership with Cargill focused on poultry markets, nutrition, and livelihoods. The evidence supports meaningful partnership. It does not let us make a sweeping claim about how much Heifer coordinates with every organization in the livestock gifting field.
So real strength, but with less evidence than Make Markets Work.
And master the art of adaptation may be Heifer's clearest institutional strength. It began with international livestock shipments, then moved towards locally sourced animals. It added training and community participation. It shifted from assets alone to market systems and living income. And those are not cosmetic changes. They are changes in what the organization thinks causes poverty and what it thinks is required to reduce it. And share leadership is a little more complicated. There are elements of it in the program design. Passing on the gift turns recipients into future givers. Full participation asks communities to help shape projects rather than simply receive them. But that is not the same thing as proving that power is broadly shared throughout the organization's governance. We did not find enough independently sourced detail about board composition, decision rights, or community representation in governance to make a stronger claim.
So, promising program design, but insufficient public evidence for this.
That's a fair conclusion. The weakest fit from Crutchfield and Grant's framework is probably advocate and serve. Heifer does direct service and development programming at scale. It has also participated in advocacy partnerships around extreme poverty. But compared with organizations whose public identity is built around sustained policy advocacy, litigation, or electoral organizing, Heifer's public footprint is still primarily programmatic and philanthropic.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Crutchfield and Grant's framework is useful because it helps us to see different ways nonprofits create impact, not because every organization has to excel at all 6 practices.
Right. An organization can be highly effective by being clear about the few practices it is built to do well, and by partnering with other organizations that bring different strengths.
So what's the transferable lesson here? Not just for nonprofits, not just for animal gifts.
I'd say it's when the thing you are building becomes more sophisticated than the thing you are selling, you usually cannot replace the old story overnight. You may have to let both run for a while. The simple story that helps people understand and support the work, and the more complicated story that reflects how the work actually gets done. That overlap can feel inefficient or inconsistent, but it's also the cost of evolving in public in front of the people who fund you.
Let's go full circle back to World Central Kitchen. Its Chicken Kit project gives Ukrainian families hens, feed, and basic care guidance. World Central Kitchen presents it as relief assistance rather than as a catalog product that a donor can personally purchase for a particular family.
That means that World Central Kitchen has, at least so far, avoided Heifer's exact catalog tension. Whether it eventually turns that project into a donor-facing product is a question for another day.
Heifer's founding promise was a cow, not a cup of milk. 80 years later, the organization has discovered that a cow needs much more than a donor and a recipient to succeed.
And that is why the catalog remains both Heifer's greatest strength and its most complicated inheritance.
Thanks for listening to Perdure.
Like us, follow us, tell your friends, leave us a good rating. We'll be back soon with another episode on the business models of organizations doing well by doing good.